The fear in their eyes was the first sign that something was wrong with me. Not the obvious fear that comes from facing a dangerous enemy or witnessing something terrible, but a deeper, more primal terror that seemed to emanate from the very core of their being when they looked in my direction. It was as if my mere presence triggered some ancient survival instinct that screamed at them to run, to hide, to get as far away from me as possible. My name was Elena Voss. I had been a student at the Schola Progenium on Ophelia 7th, preparing for a life of service to the Emperor in whatever capacity my aptitude tests determined. My scores were adequate across all disciplines, not exceptional, but sufficient for placement in the administratum, or perhaps the adepta sororitas, if I proved sufficiently devout during advanced theological training. But I was different. I had always been different, though I didn't understand why until the Culexus assassins came for me. The earliest signs manifested during my childhood years at the Schola, subtle disturbances that were initially attributed to normal adolescent adjustment difficulties. My wet nurses had been the first to experience unexplained anxiety when caring for me as an infant, reporting persistent nightmares and feelings of dread that coincided with their shifts. The medical staff dismissed these complaints as stress-related, rotating personnel to prevent burnout without investigating the common factor in all cases. As I grew older, the effects became more pronounced and harder to ignore. Instructors would find excuses to cut short their individual sessions with me, claiming sudden headaches or urgent appointments that required their immediate attention. Study groups that included me would gradually dissolve as other students developed mysterious aversions to participating in activities where I was present. The first major incident occurred during my 10th year, when instructor Calvinus attempted to discipline me for what he perceived as inattentiveness during theological instruction. He had been lecturing about the emperor's divine nature when he noticed that I was staring out the window instead of following his presentation. His attempt to regain my attention through physical proximity triggered a response that neither of us understood at the time. As he approached my desk, his confident stride gradually slowed, then stopped entirely when he came within 2 meters of my position. His face went pale, his hands began to tremble, and he started breathing in short, panicked gasps, as if he were drowning in air that had suddenly become too thick to process. When he tried to speak, only whispers emerged from his throat, words about emptiness and the void that made no sense in the context of a routine disciplinary interaction. The other students watched in confusion as their instructor backed away from me with obvious terror, his eyes never leaving my face, as if I had suddenly transformed into some kind of predator. He completed the rest of the lesson from the far side of the classroom, speaking in a voice that shook with barely controlled panic, while constantly glancing toward the door as if planning an emergency escape. That evening, Instructor Calvinus requested a transfer to different duties, citing personal reasons that he refused to elaborate upon despite repeated inquiries from his superiors. He was replaced by Instructor Vane, whose first encounter with me produced similar results with even more dramatic physical symptoms, including nausea and temporary loss of coordination. The pattern repeated itself with increasing frequency as word spread among the faculty about the student who somehow caused psychological disturbances in those around her. Each new instructor approached me with growing apprehension, their nervousness escalating into terror as my proximity triggered responses they couldn't understand or control. But it wasn't just the instructors who were affected. My fellow students began displaying increasingly obvious avoidance behaviors that went far beyond normal social rejection. They would change direction in corridors to avoid passing near me, sit as far away as possible during communal activities, and speak in hushed whispers that stopped abruptly whenever I approached. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong came during my 14th year, when the other students began avoiding me with increasing desperation. What had started as casual social distance gradually evolved into something approaching terror. My dormitory roommates requested transfers to different quarters, claiming they couldn't sleep properly due to persistent nightmares that only occurred when I was present. Sarah Kellyan, who had been assigned as my roommate during our 13th year, lasted longer than most before requesting reassignment. She described her experiences during the exit interview that all students were required to complete when changing living arrangements. The nightmares, she explained, weren't about specific events or fears, but rather a sense of overwhelming emptiness that seemed to drain meaning from everything around her. "It's like staring into a hole that goes all the way through the universe," she told the dormitory supervisor, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I look at Elena, I feel like I'm about to fall into something that never ends. I can't explain it better than that, but I can't live with it anymore." My study partners found excuses to work alone rather than participate in group projects that required extended contact with me. Even casual interactions became increasingly strained as people struggled to maintain normal conversation while fighting against instinctive urges to flee from my presence. Marcus Chen, who had been one of my few consistent companions during our early years, finally explained his decision to avoid me during what turned out to be our last private conversation. "There's something wrong with you, Elena," he said, his voice filled with confusion and regret. "Not wrong like you're bad or evil, but wrong like you're not supposed to exist. Being around you feels like being next to an open grave. I can't help it, and I can't fight it anymore." Even the instructors seemed uncomfortable in my presence, cutting their interactions with me to the absolute minimum required by institutional protocol. Classes that should have included individual attention and personalized instruction became exercises in maintaining distance while fulfilling basic educational requirements. The isolation was devastating for someone who had spent her entire life seeking acceptance and belonging within the rigid structure of imperial education. I tried everything to understand what I had done wrong, what crime I had committed that warranted such complete social rejection. I reviewed my behavior for signs of offensive conduct, examined my academic performance for evidence of failure, searched for any transgression that might explain why everyone around me seemed to find my very existence unbearable. I spent hours in the facility's small chapel, praying to the Emperor for guidance and understanding. I confessed sins I wasn't sure I had committed, begged for forgiveness for offenses I couldn't identify, and pleaded for the ability to connect with other human beings in ways that didn't cause them pain. But the prayers felt hollow, as if they were disappearing into a void that swallowed meaning rather than carrying it to divine attention. The religious instruction that formed a central component of our education became particularly difficult as I began to notice that even the sacred seemed diminished by my presence. The candles that burned continuously in the chapel would flicker and dim when I approached, while the incense that should have created an atmosphere of reverence seemed to lose its fragrance in my vicinity. Sister Magdalena, the chapel's primary attendant, began showing the same signs of distress that affected everyone else who spent extended time near me. During one particularly intense theological discussion about the nature of the soul, she suddenly stopped speaking mid-sentence, her face contorting with an expression of profound horror, as if she had glimpsed something that challenged her fundamental beliefs about the universe. "Child," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotions she couldn't name, "I fear there is something about you that exists beyond the Emperor's light. I don't mean that you serve darkness, but rather that you exist in a place where neither light nor darkness can penetrate. It terrifies me in ways I cannot explain or overcome. The truth was far more disturbing than any mistake I might have made. I wasn't being rejected for anything I had done, but for something I was, something fundamental about my nature that other humans could perceive on a level deeper than conscious thought. I was what the Imperium called a blank, or more technically, a pariah. My soul, if such a thing existed, created a void in the warp, an absence of psychic energy that affected everyone around me in ways they couldn't understand, but couldn't ignore. To normal humans, being near me felt like standing next to an open grave, a constant reminder of death and emptiness that triggered their deepest fears. The condition manifested differently in different people, but the underlying response was always the same. An instinctive recognition that something essential was missing from my being, something that existed in every other human they had ever encountered. Some experienced nausea and headaches when forced to remain in my vicinity for extended periods. Others reported feeling inexplicably sad or anxious, as if I were somehow draining the joy from their existence simply by being present. A few claimed that looking directly at me made them feel as if they were staring into an abyss that threatened to swallow their very souls. These individuals would quickly avert their gaze when they realized they were looking at me, their faces showing the kind of revulsion typically reserved for the most horrifying forms of corruption or mutation. But for psychers, my presence was pure agony. The handful of sanctioned psychers who served the Schola as instructors and advisors couldn't bear to be in the same room with me. When forced to interact due to administrative necessity, they would begin trembling uncontrollably, their faces pale with terror, their voices barely audible whispers that spoke of encountering something that violated the fundamental nature of reality itself. The first psyker to encounter me directly had been Lexiconum Thane, a minor telepath assigned to conduct routine psychic evaluations of students who showed potential for further development. The screening was supposed to be a formality, a quick assessment to determine whether I possessed any latent psychic abilities that might require specialized training or monitoring. I watched from my chair as he approached me with the confidence of someone who had performed thousands of similar evaluations. His psychic probe touched the edge of my consciousness and simply disappeared. Not blocked or deflected, but completely absorbed into whatever void existed where my soul should have been. The look of confusion on his face quickly transformed into horror as he realized what he was dealing with. The feedback effect was immediate and catastrophic. His psychic abilities, which had been carefully trained and controlled over decades of service, suddenly recoiled as if they had touched something so fundamentally wrong that they refused to function properly. He began screaming, not with his voice but with his mind, psychic shrieks that caused every other psyker in the facility to double over in sympathetic agony. The sound was audible even to non-psychic individuals, a keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Books fell from shelves, windows cracked from the psychic pressure, and several sensitive individuals throughout the facility began experiencing spontaneous nosebleeds and severe headaches. When he finally collapsed, blood was streaming from his eyes, nose, and ears, while his hands clawed at his head as if trying to physically remove something that had lodged itself in his brain. His body convulsed for several minutes as the medical staff struggled to stabilize his condition, unsure of how to treat injuries that had no physical cause. The medical staff who treated him could find no physical cause for his condition. His brain scans showed no damage. His vital signs gradually returned to normal, and his other psychic abilities remained intact. But he would never speak of what he had experienced when his consciousness touched mine. And he could never again be in the same room with me without immediately falling into convulsions. More disturbing was the effect my presence had on the other psychers who had felt his psychic scream. They began reporting nightmares about the Empty One, dreams of falling into voids that existed between reality and non-existence. Several requested transfers to other facilities, claiming that the knowledge of my presence made it impossible for them to perform their duties effectively. Adept Korath, the facility's senior astropath, described the experience in his report to higher authorities. The child creates a wound in reality itself, a tear in the fabric of psychic space that draws in and destroys everything that approaches it. To touch her consciousness is to experience the ultimate negation of existence, a form of anti-being that threatens to unmake everything that defines conscious life. That incident marked the beginning of my complete isolation within the Schola Progenium. Word spread quickly about the student who had somehow damaged a sanctioned psyker simply by existing in his proximity. The faculty began treating me not as a problem to be solved, but as a dangerous anomaly that required careful containment until proper authorities could determine what to do with me. They moved me to private quarters in the facility's isolation wing, a section originally designed for students who had contracted communicable diseases, but which now served to quarantine someone whose very presence was toxic to the psychological well-being of those around her. The quarters were comfortable enough: a small room with basic furnishings, access to educational materials, and regular meal delivery. But they were also completely cut off from any meaningful human contact. The isolation protocol was implemented with clinical efficiency, but obvious reluctance. The staff members responsible for my care had been specifically selected for their psychological stability and ability to function despite extreme stress. But even they showed signs of distress when required to spend extended time in my presence. My meals were delivered by a rotating schedule that ensured no single individual would be exposed to my influence for more than a few minutes at a time. The staff members who brought food or educational materials would complete their tasks as quickly as possible before retreating to safer distances, their relief at escaping my presence obvious despite their professional attempts to maintain normal courtesy. The loneliness was indescribable. Humans are social creatures by nature, requiring interaction and connection for psychological health and development. To be completely cut off from such contact during the formative years of adolescence was a form of torture that no sadist could have designed more effectively than my own genetic heritage had accomplished. The silence was the worst part. After years of living in communal dormitories filled with constant conversation, laughter, arguments, and the simple sounds of other people going about their daily lives, the absolute quiet of my isolation chamber felt like being buried alive. I found myself talking to myself just to hear a human voice, but even that provided little comfort when I knew that no one was listening. I tried to create imaginary companions, elaborate mental conversations with fictional friends who could provide the social interaction that real humans couldn't tolerate. But these fantasy relationships felt hollow and unsatisfying, emphasizing rather than relieving the profound loneliness that had become the defining characteristic of my existence. My education continued through remote instruction, data slates, and vid screens replacing human teachers who could no longer bear to share physical space with me. The material was the same as what other students received: imperial history, tactical doctrine, administrative procedures, theological instruction. But it felt hollow and meaningless when delivered without the context of human community that gave learning its purpose. The automated instruction systems were efficient but soulless, providing information without the personal engagement that made education transformative rather than simply informative. I could memorize facts and procedures, but I couldn't participate in the discussions and debates that helped students understand the deeper meaning behind the material they were studying. Most painfully, I was cut off from the religious instruction that should have provided spiritual guidance during this difficult period of my life. The chapel services that other students attended daily were impossible for me to participate in, as my presence disrupted the sense of sacred community that made worship meaningful. Even private prayer felt futile when I suspected that whatever void existed where my soul should be might be preventing my communications from reaching the Emperor. I tried to understand what was happening to me by studying everything I could find about psychic phenomena and unusual human variants. The Schola's library contained extensive materials on sanctioned psychers, their training methods, and their role within imperial society. The information was comprehensive and well organized, covering everything from basic psychic theory to advanced techniques for managing and directing psychic abilities. But information about pariahs was limited and heavily classified, suggesting that my condition was both extremely rare and potentially dangerous enough to warrant institutional secrecy. The few references I could find described blanks as genetic anomalies that occurred perhaps once in every billion births, individuals whose souls existed in a state of psychic null that made them invisible to warp-based perception and unbearable to normal human consciousness. The historical records painted a disturbing picture of how such individuals had been treated throughout human history. In some cultures, they had been worshipped as living gods, whose presence could ward off demons and malevolent spirits. In others, they had been killed at birth as abominations, whose very existence threatened the natural order. Most commonly, they had been feared and avoided, living as outcasts who could never fully participate in the communities that surrounded them. The Imperium's approach was more pragmatic, but no less isolating. Pariahs were valuable resources that could be deployed against psychic threats that normal humans couldn't handle. They were recruited for specialized roles that exploited their unique abilities while keeping them isolated from the general population that couldn't tolerate their presence. The theoretical materials I could access described the mechanism behind my condition in clinical terms that somehow made it more rather than less disturbing. My genes contained mutations that affected the development of the structures responsible for generating what Imperial science called soul light, the psychic emanation that existed in every normal human being. Instead of producing this energy, my consciousness created what the texts described as psychic null, an active negation of warp-based phenomena that absorbed and destroyed psychic energy rather than generating it. This null field was what caused the fear response in normal humans. Their subconscious minds could detect the absence of soul light around me, interpreting this absence as a form of death or non-existence that triggered deep survival instincts. Being near me felt like standing next to a black hole in reality, a void that threatened to drain away everything that made existence meaningful. The more I learned, the more I understood why the Culexus assassins were considered necessary, but feared even by the institutions that employed them. We weren't just weapons against psychic threats. We were living reminders of what humans became when they lost the spark that connected them to the larger tapestry of consciousness that bound the species together. The Culexus representatives arrived 6 months after the incident with Lexiconum Thane, appearing at the Schola without prior announcement and with authority that superseded all local protocols. They wore plain black uniforms that bore no insignia beyond the simple skull and crossbone symbol of the Officio Assassinorum, and they moved with the fluid precision that marked them as individuals whose every action was calculated to achieve maximum efficiency. Interrogator Assassin Malik was their leader, a man whose age was impossible to determine and whose presence seemed to create zones of silence wherever he moved. His face was completely expressionless, as if the muscles responsible for conveying emotion had been surgically removed or simply never developed. When he spoke, his voice carried no inflection whatsoever, delivering information with the mechanical precision of a data recording device. Unlike everyone else who had dealt with me over the past months, he showed no signs of discomfort in my vicinity. If anything, he appeared more at ease around me than he did when interacting with normal humans, as if my psychic void provided relief from the constant background noise of other minds. His lack of fear response was initially comforting, until I realized that it indicated something fundamental about his own nature that might be even more disturbing than my condition. "Elena Voss," he said, consulting a data slate while ignoring the Scola officials who had accompanied him to my quarters. Designation Null 743, age 16, standard Terran years. Psychic rating -epsilon, extreme. Assessment suitable for Culexus program with immediate effect. The clinical terminology reduced my entire existence to a series of measurements and classifications that emphasized my utility as a weapon rather than my identity as a human being. I was no longer Elena Voss, student and potential servant of the Emperor. I was Null 7743, a psychic anomaly with specific parameters that made me valuable for particular applications. The Scola's administrators tried to object to my removal, citing proper procedures and administrative protocols that required advance notification and parental consent. Director Cassius, who had been responsible for my education despite his obvious discomfort with my presence, attempted to argue that my academic progress warranted completion of my current course of study before any transfer could be considered. Malik listened to their protests with obvious disinterest before producing authorization documents that carried seals I didn't recognize, but which clearly held sufficient authority to override any local concerns. The documents bore the signature of authorities whose names I had never heard, but whose power was apparently absolute within the imperial hierarchy. "Imperial decree," he explained in a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever. "All identified pariah-class individuals are to be transferred immediately to Officio Assassinorum custody for evaluation and training. This child is no longer a student at this facility. She is now property of the Emperor, to be shaped according to his will." The words "property of the Emperor" struck me like physical blows. I had always understood that my life belonged to the Imperium in the abstract sense that all citizens owed service to the institutions that protected humanity. But this was different. A declaration that my individual existence was now completely subordinate to the needs of organizations that would reshape me according to specifications I had no voice in determining. Director Cassius made one final attempt to delay my transfer, suggesting that additional psychological evaluation might be beneficial before such a dramatic change in my circumstances. Malik's response was delivered with the same mechanical precision that characterized all his communications. "The psychological evaluation has been completed. This individual's isolation from normal human contact has already begun the conditioning process that will be completed during formal training. Further delay would only interfere with protocols that have been established through millennia of experience with pariah subjects." The transition was immediate and absolute. Within an hour of Malik's arrival, I was aboard a nondescript transport vessel heading toward a destination that wasn't disclosed to me or to the Scola officials who had been responsible for my care. My few personal possessions were left behind. Everything that had connected me to my previous existence was abandoned as irrelevant to whatever I was about to become. The ship itself was unlike any Imperial vessel I had encountered in educational materials or propaganda presentations. Instead of the elaborate decoration and religious iconography that characterized most imperial architecture, everything was purely functional, designed for efficiency rather than inspiration. The corridors were wide enough for easy movement, but narrow enough to prevent congregating, while the lighting was carefully calibrated to reduce shadows that might provide concealment. The ship's crew treated me with professional indifference, neither friendly nor hostile, but simply acknowledging my presence as another piece of cargo to be transported to its designated destination. Their lack of the usual fear response was initially comforting, until I realized that they had been specifically selected and conditioned to work with psychic anomalies. Even the food was part of the conditioning process, consisting of nutrition bars and liquid supplements that provided adequate sustenance while eliminating the sensory pleasure typically associated with eating. Each meal was identical to the last, designed to reduce anticipation and satisfaction while maintaining the basic biological functions necessary for survival. Malik visited my cabin once during the voyage, ostensibly to conduct an evaluation, but primarily to begin the psychological conditioning that would prepare me for what was to come. He explained that my previous life had ended the moment I was identified as a pariah, that Elena Voss, the student, no longer existed except as raw material to be refined into something more useful. The conversation took place while I sat on my narrow bunk, and he occupied the single chair provided by the cabin's minimal furnishings. Despite the confined space, he showed no signs of discomfort in my presence, his emotionless expression never changing as he delivered what amounted to a systematic dismantling of everything I had believed about my own identity and future. "You must understand," he said with clinical precision, "that what you were is irrelevant to what you will become. Your childhood, your dreams, your personal attachments, all of these are distractions from your true purpose. The Emperor has gifted you with abilities that make you valuable as a weapon against his enemies. Everything else about you is waste material to be discarded." He proceeded to catalog every aspect of my personality and history that would be eliminated during the training process. My desire for human connection would be replaced by operational efficiency that functioned without need for emotional support. My curiosity about the wider universe would be focused into specialized knowledge that served tactical objectives. My hope for a meaningful future would be transformed into absolute dedication to assigned missions, regardless of personal cost. The psychological preparation was subtle but relentless. He questioned every aspect of my identity, forcing me to acknowledge that my social isolation had already begun the process of disconnecting me from normal human experience. My classmates had rejected me. My instructors had feared me. My family had abandoned me to institutional care because they couldn't bear to be around me. "What human connection do you have left to mourn?" he asked during one particularly intensive session. "What relationships exist that your transformation would actually cost you? You have already lost everything that makes normal human life meaningful. We are offering you the chance to gain something valuable in return: purpose, effectiveness, the ability to serve the Emperor in ways that ordinary humans never could." His arguments were logically sound and emotionally devastating. I had indeed lost everything that most people considered essential to happiness and fulfillment. My isolation at the Scola had been complete, my future prospects limited to whatever solitary role might be found for someone whose presence was toxic to those around her. The Culexus program might represent a form of slavery, but it was slavery that offered meaning and belonging within a community of similarly altered individuals. More insidiously, his words carried an implicit promise that my suffering had been meaningful, that the years of loneliness and rejection had been preparation for something greater rather than simple tragedy. The idea that my condition was not a cruel accident, but part of some divine plan, provided comfort that I desperately needed, even though I suspected that such comfort was part of the manipulation designed to make me accept my fate willingly. By the time we reached our destination, I had already begun the psychological transformation that would remake me into something that served imperial needs rather than personal desires. The process felt natural rather than forced, like finally accepting a truth about myself that I had been avoiding for years. The realization that I had no other viable options made the conditioning process psychologically easier to accept while making it more rather than less disturbing. I wasn't choosing to become a Culexus assassin, so much as I was acknowledging that becoming a weapon was the only way someone like me could find purpose within the Imperial system. The Culexus facility was located on a world whose name was never disclosed to me, a planet that existed solely to serve the training and operational needs of the Imperium's most specialized assassins. The landscape visible during our descent was bleak and inhospitable, consisting of rocky wastelands broken by massive fortress complexes that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome those who approached them. The architecture was brutal and functional, massive structures of gray stone and black metal that seemed designed to emphasize the powerlessness of individuals in the face of institutional authority. The buildings rose from the barren ground like geometric mountains, their surfaces unmarked by decoration or ornamentation that might provide comfort or inspiration to those who dwelt within them. Everything about the environment was calculated to reinforce the psychological conditioning that would transform raw pariahs into effective weapons. The corridors were too wide and too long, creating a sense of isolation even when other people were present. The ceilings were too high, making individuals feel small and insignificant within spaces designed to dwarf human proportions. The lighting was too bright or too dim, never quite comfortable for human vision, ensuring a constant low-level discomfort that prevented true relaxation. The air recycling systems created a constant low-level hum that prevented true silence while making normal conversation difficult. The sound was pitched at frequencies that created psychological unease, a subliminal pressure that encouraged submission while discouraging independent thought. Even the temperature was carefully controlled, maintained at levels that were uncomfortable without being unbearable, another constant reminder of dependency on institutional systems. But most importantly, the facility was staffed entirely by individuals who had been conditioned to work with blanks. Instructors, support personnel, medical staff, all of them had undergone extensive psychological conditioning that allowed them to function in close proximity to psychic voids without experiencing the usual fear responses. The conditioning had transformed them into something that resembled normal humans, but lacked the essential spark that made human interaction meaningful. They treated us with professional efficiency, but their acceptance felt hollow compared to genuine human warmth. They could function around us without terror, but they couldn't connect with us in ways that provided the emotional nourishment that all conscious beings required for psychological health. The other trainees were a mixture of ages and backgrounds, united only by the genetic anomaly that had marked us for this particular form of service. Some had been identified early, as I had been, and recruited from imperial institutions where their presence had caused disruption and fear. Others had been discovered later in life, after their psychic void had been triggered by traumatic events or exposure to warp phenomena. Marcus Thorne had been a factory worker on Armageddon whose pariah abilities had manifested during an orc invasion, his psychic void providing protection against enemy psychers while driving his fellow workers to desperate attempts to avoid his presence. The manifestation had been sudden and traumatic, transforming him overnight from a valued member of his work crew into someone whose mere presence made normal operations impossible. He described the experience during one of our rare conversations in the facility's common areas. One day, I was just another shift supervisor managing production quotas, and the next day, my own workers were crossing themselves whenever they saw me coming. They couldn't explain why they were afraid of me, but they couldn't hide it either. The productivity numbers started dropping because people would rather face disciplinary action than work near me. Sarah Kellyan had been discovered during her service as a void ship crew member when her presence had prevented a chaos cult from successfully possessing members of her unit. The chaos psyker who had attempted the possession had been driven insane by contact with her psychic void, his mind shattered by exposure to the absolute negation of everything his power represented. Her story was particularly disturbing because it revealed how pariah abilities could manifest under stress. I never knew I was different until that daemon tried to get inside my head, she explained. When its consciousness touched mine, I felt something inside me just eat it. Not like I was fighting back, but like there was a hole where my soul should be that just swallowed everything it tried to do. Each of us had a story of rejection, isolation, and eventual recruitment by an organization that valued what others feared. We were united by shared experience of being treated as abominations by normal humanity, and that shared experience created a form of camaraderie that none of us had previously experienced. The exercises she put us through were designed to help us understand and control the effect our presence had on others. We learned to modulate the intensity of our psychic void, focusing it like a beam to maximize its impact on specific targets while minimizing collateral effects. The training involved meditation techniques that seemed paradoxical, achieving states of emptiness that were even more complete than our natural condition. We practiced using our abilities in combination with conventional weapons, creating tactical approaches that no normal assassin could employ. A blank could approach enemy psychers without triggering their supernatural senses, infiltrate chaos cults without being detected by their corruption-sensing rituals, and eliminate demon-possessed individuals who were immune to conventional weapons. But we also learned about the limitations of our abilities and the dangers that came with weaponizing our own nature. Overuse of our psychic void could drain our own life force, leaving us weakened or even comatose. Prolonged exposure to warp phenomena could destabilize our null field, potentially transforming us into something even more dangerous and uncontrollable. The most disturbing aspect of the training was how natural it felt. The abilities we were developing seemed to flow from the same source as the unconscious effects we had always produced. Learning to weaponize my psychic void felt like finally understanding how to use a limb that had been paralyzed since birth, liberating and terrifying in equal measure. The exercises progressed from simple meditative techniques to complex tactical scenarios that required precise control over abilities we were only beginning to understand. We learned to create zones of psychic null that could disrupt enemy rituals, project our void effects at distance to affect targets we couldn't physically reach, and coordinate our abilities with other blanks to create fields of absolute negation that nothing warp-based could penetrate. But the process came at a cost that became apparent only gradually. As we learned to control and direct our abilities, we also lost the capacity for normal human emotional responses. The psychic void that made us effective against warp-based threats also seemed to drain away our ability to form meaningful emotional connections with other people. Love, friendship, empathy. All of these required a form of spiritual resonance that our nature made impossible. We could understand these emotions intellectually, recognize their tactical value, and even simulate them for operational purposes. But we could no longer experience them authentically, having been cut off from the psychic dimension that made genuine human connection possible. The realization came slowly, so gradually that I didn't immediately recognize what was being lost. My memories of caring about other people remained intact, but they felt increasingly abstract, like reading about emotions in a technical manual rather than recalling genuine experiences. The loneliness that had tormented me during my isolation at the Scola faded away, replaced by a cold acceptance of solitude that felt more comfortable than distressing. I tried to mourn the loss of my capacity for human connection, but found that I lacked the emotional resources to experience grief in any meaningful way. The person who had once yearned for acceptance and belonging was disappearing, replaced by someone who viewed such needs as weaknesses that interfered with operational effectiveness. The change was so subtle that I might not have noticed it without the contrast provided by my memories of what I had been before. The Elena Voss, who had desperately wanted friends and social acceptance, was becoming something that could function without such connections, something that found satisfaction in perfect performance rather than human relationship. More disturbing was the growing recognition that this transformation was being celebrated by our instructors as evidence of successful progress. The elimination of emotional attachment was not an unfortunate side effect of our training, but its primary objective: the creation of weapons that could function without the psychological limitations that made normal humans unreliable in extreme situations. The physical modifications began during our second year of training, surgical alterations designed to enhance our natural abilities while integrating us with the specialized equipment that would define our operational role. The procedures were extensive and invasive, involving the installation of neural implants that allowed direct interface with our signature armor systems. The first surgery involved the installation of basic neural interfaces that would eventually connect to our anima speculum, the distinctive helmet-mounted device that would become the symbol of our new identity. The operation required drilling through the skull to access specific regions of the brain, then installing crystalline matrices that could interface with both organic neural tissue and mechanical systems. The procedure was performed without anesthesia, not out of cruelty, but because the surgeons needed to monitor our psychic void throughout the operation to ensure proper integration with the mechanical components. The pain was unlike anything I had ever experienced, not just physical, but somehow spiritual, as if the surgeons were operating on my soul as well as my brain. But the discomfort was accompanied by a strange sense of completion, as if missing pieces of my identity were finally being installed. The neural interfaces felt natural once the initial trauma subsided, like organs that had always been missing, but whose absence had never been consciously noticed. Additional modifications followed over the subsequent months. Optical enhancements that improved target acquisition and threat assessment capabilities. Cardiovascular modifications that increased endurance and reduced recovery time between operations. Skeletal reinforcement that allowed us to withstand impacts that would cripple normal humans. Each modification was explained in terms of operational effectiveness, improvements that would make us more capable of fulfilling our designated role as the Emperor's weapons against psychic threats. But they also served to distance us further from normal humanity, transforming our bodies into something that could no longer be mistaken for natural human form. The most significant modification was the installation of the anima speculum, the distinctive helmet-mounted device that would become the symbol of our new identity. The speculum was more than just protective equipment. It was a psychic amplifier that focused and directed our void abilities with devastating precision. The surgery required to install the neural interfaces for the speculum was the most extensive and dangerous we had undergone, involving the insertion of multiple ports directly into the brain tissue that controlled our psychic functions. The operation took place in a sterile chamber deep within the facility's medical complex, attended by surgeons who had been specially trained to work with pariah physiology. The procedure began with the installation of a metal framework that would support the speculum's primary components. This framework was literally screwed into the bones of my skull, creating anchor points for the complex array of sensors and amplifiers that would comprise the finished device. The drilling of each anchor point sent vibrations through my entire skull, a sensation that was both agonizing and oddly rhythmic. Next came the installation of the primary neural interfaces, crystalline constructs that had to be positioned with microscopic precision to avoid damaging the organic neural tissue they would eventually replace. Each interface required the removal of a small section of brain matter, creating spaces where the artificial components could integrate with the remaining organic systems. The pain was indescribable, not just from the physical trauma, but from the sensation of having foreign objects installed in the most intimate spaces of my consciousness. I could feel the interfaces establishing connections with my neural pathways, creating new channels for information flow that felt both alien and strangely familiar. The final phase involved the activation of the installed systems, a process that required careful calibration to ensure compatibility between the mechanical components and my natural abilities. When the speculum was powered on for the first time, the sensation was overwhelming. Suddenly, I could perceive aspects of reality that had been invisible to my normal senses. When the operation was finished and the speculum was activated for the first time, the sensation was indescribable. My psychic void, which had been a passive emanation that I could partially control, became a focused weapon that I could wield with surgical precision. I could direct it like a laser beam, concentrating its effect on specific targets while leaving others completely unaffected. The improvement in capability was dramatic and immediate. Where I had previously been able to create general fields of psychic disruption, I could now target individual enemies with precision that left their allies completely unaffected. The speculum allowed me to vary the intensity and focus of my abilities, creating effects that ranged from subtle discomfort to complete psychic annihilation. More importantly, the speculum allowed me to perceive psychic phenomena directly, rather than simply negating them. Through its sensors, I could see the warp-based energies that flowed around psychers, identify the signatures of chaos corruption, and track the movements of entities that existed partially in the immaterium. I had become a hunter specifically adapted to prey on humanity's most dangerous enemies. The visual interface provided by the speculum was unlike anything available to normal human senses. I could see the flow of warp energy like streams of colored light, identify the specific signatures associated with different types of psychic phenomena, and track the movement of entities that existed partially outside normal spacetime. My first operational assignment came within days of graduation, a mission that would test my abilities against real enemies under actual field conditions. The target was a chaos cult that had infiltrated the upper levels of an Imperial Hive city's government, using their positions to prepare for a major summoning ritual that would bring a greater demon into real space. The cult's leader was a powerful psyker whose abilities had allowed him to evade detection by conventional Imperial agents. His psychic defenses made direct assault impossible, while his political connections prevented more conventional law enforcement approaches. The situation required an agent who could get close enough to strike without triggering the psychic alarms that protected him. The mission briefing took place in a secure chamber deep within the facility, attended by intelligence officers who provided detailed information about the target and the tactical challenges involved in eliminating him. The cult had been under surveillance for months, their activities monitored by agents who couldn't get close enough to gather critical intelligence due to the leader's psychic awareness. My assignment was straightforward in concept, but complex in execution. I would infiltrate the Hive city using forged identity documents, establish a cover identity that would allow me access to the government complex where the cult leader worked, and eliminate the entire leadership structure before they could complete their summoning ritual. The mission parameters were specific about acceptable collateral damage and operational timelines. The cult had to be eliminated before their ritual could be completed, but the operation had to appear like natural causes or administrative accidents to prevent panic among the general population who didn't know about the threat they faced. I infiltrated the city using forged identity documents and a cover story that placed me as a new administrative assistant in the governmental complex where the cult leader worked. My psychic void made me invisible to his supernatural senses, while my human appearance allowed me to move freely through areas that would have been inaccessible to more obvious Imperial agents. The cover identity was comprehensive and carefully constructed, complete with employment history, educational credentials, and personal references that would withstand routine investigation. I was Elena Farthest, recent graduate of an administrative training program, assigned to assist with filing and data management in the Department of Urban Planning. The observation phase of the mission lasted 3 weeks, during which I mapped the cult's structure, identified its key members, and determined the optimal approach for eliminating the threat they represented. The cult leader's routine was predictable, his security arrangements adequate against normal threats, but useless against someone who didn't register on psychic detection systems. The daily routine provided numerous opportunities for assassination, but the mission parameters required eliminating the entire cult leadership rather than just the primary target. This necessitated identifying all key members and planning a coordinated strike that would prevent survivors from completing their ritual or escaping to establish operations elsewhere. But the most disturbing aspect of the mission was witnessing the gradual corruption of normal Imperial citizens who had been drawn into the cult's web. These weren't obvious heretics or chaos fanatics, but ordinary people who had been slowly manipulated into serving powers they didn't understand. Their transformation from loyal citizens into enemies of humanity was a reminder of how easily human souls could be corrupted by exposure to chaos influence. The corruption process was subtle but relentless, beginning with minor favors and gradually escalating into more serious compromises. A clerk might be asked to misfile a document, then to delay processing a permit, then to provide information about Imperial security procedures. Each step seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they created a pattern of cooperation that made further corruption psychologically easier to accept. I watched as decent people made small compromises that led to larger ones, each decision making the next one easier to rationalize. By the time they realized the true nature of what they were supporting, they were too deeply involved to extract themselves without facing consequences they couldn't accept. The elimination took place during what appeared to be a routine administrative meeting, when the cult leader was surrounded by his closest associates in a conference room that provided optimal conditions for my attack. The meeting had been called to finalize plans for their ritual, making it the perfect opportunity to eliminate the entire leadership structure simultaneously. I had positioned myself as a secretary responsible for taking minutes during the meeting, a role that placed me in the conference room while keeping me invisible to the participants who had become accustomed to ignoring support staff. My anima speculum was concealed beneath the administrative headset, that was common equipment for clerical workers in government facilities. When the cult leader began the meeting by invoking chaos powers to ensure their discussions remained hidden from Imperial surveillance, I activated my speculum and focused its full power on the assembled group. The effect was immediate and absolute. The cult leader's psychic defenses collapsed instantly, leaving him helpless and disoriented as his chaos-granted abilities disappeared. His associates, who had been preparing to participate in a ritual summoning that evening, found themselves cut off from the warp energies that had sustained their corruption. The follow-up was swift and efficient. I eliminated the cult leader with a single shot from a concealed weapon, then systematically executed his associates before they could recover from the psychic disruption. The entire operation took less than 10 minutes, leaving no survivors and no evidence that might compromise other Imperial operations in the area. But the mission's completion brought no satisfaction, no sense of accomplishment or personal fulfillment. I had performed the task assigned to me with perfect efficiency, eliminated dangerous enemies of humanity, and prevented a chaos incursion that could have claimed thousands of lives. Yet I felt nothing about these achievements, viewing them as simply the expected outcome of proper operational procedure. This emotional void was the price of my transformation, the cost of becoming a weapon effective enough to hunt humanity's most dangerous enemies. I had gained abilities that made me invaluable to the Imperium's defense, but I had lost everything that might have made those abilities personally meaningful. The extraction from the Hive City proceeded according to plan, my cover identity providing the necessary documentation to leave through normal transportation channels without attracting attention. The local authorities would eventually discover the deaths and investigate them as a possible criminal conspiracy. But they would find no evidence connecting the incident to Imperial operations or Chaos Cult activities. The years that followed brought dozens of similar missions, each one targeting threats that normal Imperial agents couldn't handle. Rogue psychers who had escaped detection by the Black Ships. Chaos cults that had infiltrated vital Imperial institutions. Demon princes whose power made them immune to conventional weapons. Each assignment was completed with professional efficiency and complete emotional detachment. The missions took me across the galaxy, from the fortress worlds of the Segmentum Solar to the frontier colonies of the Eastern Fringe. Each assignment was different in its specific parameters, but identical in its fundamental requirements. Locate enemies that conventional forces couldn't detect, eliminate them without causing political complications, and ensure that no evidence remained that might compromise other Imperial operations. I became expert at psychological manipulation, learning to simulate human emotions convincingly enough to maintain cover identities for extended periods. I could fake friendship, romantic interest, professional camaraderie, or any other emotional state that my mission required. But these were purely tactical skills, performances designed to achieve operational objectives rather than expressions of genuine feeling. The ability to simulate emotions without experiencing them made me highly effective at infiltration operations that required extended social interaction. I could maintain cover identities for months if necessary, developing relationships with targets and their associates while remaining completely unaffected by genuine human connection or affection. But the simulated emotions felt increasingly hollow as time passed, reminders of capacities I had once possessed but could no longer access. I could remember what it felt like to care about other people, but the memories were abstract and intellectualized, like technical manuals describing processes I could no longer perform. The other Culexus assassins I encountered during joint operations or facility meetings were similarly altered, their humanity reduced to the minimum necessary for effective function. We could work together efficiently, sharing intelligence and coordinating tactics, but we could no longer form the kinds of bonds that made such cooperation personally meaningful. Marcus Thorne had become a perfect killing machine, his former personality completely subsumed beneath layers of conditioning that left him capable of nothing beyond mission execution. When we worked together on a joint operation targeting a chaos cult that had infiltrated a Forge World's tech priest hierarchy, his performance was flawless, but completely mechanical. He moved through the mission parameters with robotic precision, eliminating targets with surgical efficiency, while showing no more emotional response than a servitor performing routine maintenance. The man who had once been a factory supervisor concerned about the welfare of his workers had been transformed into something that could calculate acceptable casualty rates without experiencing any psychological stress about the human cost of operational decisions. Sarah Kellyan retained more of her original character, but it was like watching someone perform an impersonation of their former self, rather than expressing genuine personality. She could engage in conversation that seemed natural and spontaneous, but every response felt calculated for tactical effect, rather than emerging from authentic emotional states. During a mission briefing where we discussed the elimination of a rogue astropath whose uncontrolled transmissions were attracting demon attention, she provided analysis that was tactically sound but emotionally hollow. She could describe the target's psychological profile with perfect accuracy while showing no recognition that she was discussing the destruction of another sentient being. We were all ghosts of the people we had once been, retaining the outward appearance of humanity while possessing none of its essential qualities. We served the Emperor faithfully and efficiently, but our service was that of machines rather than conscious beings who chose their dedication through personal conviction. The realization that we had become something fundamentally different from human beings was driven home during interactions with normal Imperial personnel who hadn't undergone conditioning to work with blanks. Their fear responses provided a constant reminder of what we had become, reflecting the horror that ordinary humans felt when confronted with consciousness that had been stripped of everything that made it recognizably alive. Decades passed in this existence of perfect efficiency and complete emotional emptiness. I eliminated hundreds of enemies, prevented countless chaos incursions, and saved millions of lives through my actions. My service record was exemplary, my reliability absolute, my value to the Imperium unquestioned. But I had lost everything that made such service meaningful on a personal level. I could remember being Elena Voss, the lonely student who had yearned for acceptance and belonging. But those memories felt like historical documents rather than personal experiences, interesting but irrelevant to my current existence. The conditioning that had made me effective as an assassin had also made me incapable of growth, change, or development beyond the parameters established by my training. I was frozen in a state of perfect operational readiness, unable to evolve or adapt except in ways that served my designated function. Sometimes I wondered what my life might have been like if I had been born normal, if I had possessed the capacity for human connection that would have allowed me to form relationships and find meaning through bonds with other people. But such speculation felt academic, like considering alternative historical scenarios that had no bearing on present reality. The Imperium had taken a genetic anomaly that caused fear and revulsion in normal humans and transformed it into a weapon of devastating effectiveness against its enemies. In purely tactical terms, my transformation had been a complete success. A liability had been converted into an asset. Waste material had been refined into something valuable. But the cost had been the complete elimination of everything that made existence worthwhile, for conscious beings. I had become the perfect servant, incapable of disloyalty, because I lacked the emotional capacity for personal desires that might conflict with imperial needs. I was reliable because I had been stripped of the human qualities that made reliability a choice rather than a programmed response. The philosophical implications of my existence became clearer with each passing year. I was proof that consciousness could be reduced to pure function, that everything that made life meaningful could be eliminated without destroying the basic capacity for thought and action. I was a demonstration of what humans became when they were optimized for efficiency rather than happiness. The knowledge that I represented a successful experiment in the systematic elimination of human nature should have disturbed me, but I lacked the emotional capacity for appropriate horror at my own condition. I could analyze my situation with perfect clarity while feeling no distress about its implications for my own welfare or the future of my species. This is what happens when you're selected for Culexus assassin training in the 41st Millennium. Not death, which would be merciful, but the systematic elimination of everything that makes life worth living while preserving just enough consciousness to be aware of what has been lost. We become the Emperor's perfect weapons, incapable of failure, because we have been stripped of the human qualities that make failure possible. We serve with absolute dedication, not through choice, but through the absence of alternatives. Loyal not through conviction, but through the elimination of the capacity for independent thought. The enemies of humanity fear us, and rightfully so. We are death incarnate to psychers and chaos spawn, able to eliminate threats that conventional forces cannot even perceive. We are invisible to their supernatural senses, immune to their psychic attacks, and equipped with abilities specifically designed to counter their advantages. But we are also monuments to the Imperium's willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone in pursuit of survival. We are proof that humanity will transform its own children into weapons, will strip away consciousness and emotion and identity if doing so creates more effective tools for fighting its enemies. The irony is complete. We were created to preserve humanity by becoming something that was no longer human in any meaningful sense. We protect the species by demonstrating what it becomes when optimized for efficiency rather than flourishing. We serve the Emperor by becoming examples of what imperial service costs when taken to its logical conclusion. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And in that war, some weapons are forged from steel and promethium, while others are carved from human souls. We are the latter, perfect in our effectiveness and completely empty of everything that once made us human. We remember what we were, but we can no longer care about what we have lost. We serve the Emperor faithfully, but our faith is indistinguishable from programming. We protect humanity from its enemies, but we can no longer remember why such protection matters. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the galaxy is so dangerous that even the capacity for human emotion must be sacrificed if it interferes with the defense of the species. Perhaps our transformation is justified by the enemies we eliminate and the lives we save through our perfect, emotionless efficiency. But in the quiet moments between missions, in the spaces where thoughts once flourished, there is only the mechanical humming of a consciousness that has been optimized for function rather than feeling. We have been saved from the burden of human emotion by being made incapable of experiencing it. And in that salvation, we have lost everything that once made salvation worth seeking.